Welcome to the Partners in Education Research seminar series. This is our last seminar of the semester, believe it or not. I'm Tom Kane. I'm faculty director of the Center for Education Policy Research, which hosts this seminar series. Today, Beth Tipton from Northwestern is going to be presenting. Beth is a professor of statistics and data science at Northwestern, as well as a faculty fellow at the Institute for Policy Research at Northwestern. Beth's work primarily is around the design of field experiments and synthesizing the results of studies via meta-analyses. So please join me in welcoming Beth. One word, gosh, I forgot. I usually start by a warning that that this is being recorded. So any particularly, snarky remarks, will be preserved. So if you prefer not to be remembered that way, keep that in mind. The second is we sort of operate in what's sometimes called econ style, which means you can ask the question in the moment. And we've warned Beth that, but actually, sort of the University of Chicago originated the econ style. So I'm sure you're familiar with it. So, but if things get if people bog down Beth too much, then I'll intervene to make sure we keep going. So please join me in welcoming Beth Tipton from Northwestern.
Okay, thank you very much. Any questions? Any critiques of my intro? Okay, so I'm looking forward to talking to you today. This is actually a kind of a combination. I sent you one paper, but it's actually a combination of a couple of papers, maybe two or three, of things that I've been thinking about over the years. I always like to start by saying, this is my team, these are my grad students and my postdoc, and they are what I think keep me inspired and moving along these days. What I want to talk about today is a tension that I have found to be occurring in our system, which is that decision makers always are asking, will this work in my school? They want to know, if you think about the critiques of IES right now, a lot of it is like, but schools want to know what will work in their school. But what we answer them with in evidence systems is, does it work on average? And so the problem is these are two different questions. When they're not in sync with each other, people are not satisfied when they want to know if it works in their school, and we're like, well, here's the average effect. And so this is kind of the puzzle or the tension that I have been sitting with for a long time as a statistician working in the system. So I want to start by talking about the current evidence system, and then we'll kind of move forward from there. I like to say we start by asking scientific questions in our evidence systems, right? Like that's how we work. We're all like researchers asking questions. But if you sort of take a step back and think, well, what is a scientific question? They're really specific, narrow questions, right? So a really good question has a narrowly defined problem. We're always holding constant certain things. We want to know, is it this, not this? So like if I want to know if it's this, then I have to hold constant or residual out or whatever other things that it could be, because I want to know if I want to test about this one specific thing. I love this. This is from Matt Might, who's a computer scientist. I love this image of what a dissertation is. That you've added this one tiny piece of knowledge, but in the big picture, it's actually just a little dot, right? So we have these very narrow questions. That's how we move science along. But the difficulty, I think, that occurs is that those answers to those questions then feed into an evidence system. So we took scientific questions, they feed into this evidence system, and this is just one random, I found it on the line somewhere, picture of an evidence system in which the RCT is at the top, right? Of this, of the best kind of evidence. Sometimes meta-analysis is at the top of these pyramids, but we feed it in. Now we've got these results, we tell people this is good evidence for decision making. The way that we have done this a lot is through clearinghouses. So the What Works clearinghouse has gotten a lot of criticism over the years. I like to just remind people that it's not the only clearinghouse. It's also didn't invent the idea of a clearinghouse, that governments love clearinghouses. So there's something like 17 clearinghouses in the US government as it is, in all sorts of topics. Home visiting is one. I mean, you name it, there are clearinghouses on the topic. There are in other countries. So I just searched for, clearinghouses in other countries, and you can see there's a lot of them in other countries. They're all ideas that you should be taking evident if you're going to make financial decisions. You should bring evidence to bear on those decisions. And the What Works clearinghouse is actually not that different than the way many of these other ones are set up. They are set up by reviewing literature, posting the results of that literature. So for all of the pluses and minuses of the WWC, it's not that different than these other ones. It's not like it sort of created or is the only, is different radically from the general approach. I'm going to argue that constant treatment effects are actually baked into the assumption of these clearinghouses. That we start with, we do scientific evidence, we get a finding, and then we put it in the clearinghouse, and you just think about the logic of why you would put a finding from a study into a clearinghouse and expect it to be useful to somebody else. The only way it is useful to somebody else is if the effects are constant. So even if we don't mean to, it's sort of like an implicit assumption. Think about our language. Critiques in the replication crisis have been about we want to replicate our findings in you have a different researcher replicate them. And if they don't get the same result, we don't say, that's interesting, we've just learned something. We say, it failed to replicate. It's a problem. When we talk about in meta-analysis, an area that I do results, I do a lot of work. We look across 50 studies. We average effect. We don't say it's the average effect. People talk about it as the effect of whatever the intervention is. This is the effect of growth mindset. This is the effect of CBT, whatever it is. It's the effect. And so we kind of are assuming that if you want to make sense of that there are all these different versions of an intervention, and this is like the average version right there in the middle. Those are all almost like measurement error versions. There's a true version with just like a random distribution of them, and there's a truth in there in the middle, kind of coming out of the ANOVA tradition. We get findings from studies, and we put them in clearinghouses, and we tell people that it works or doesn't work based upon that one finding. So the only way, again, that kind of makes sense is if you think that the results of that one study are immediately going to extrapolate someplace else, which works if it's constant. And even when we scale up interventions, and we talk about, if you look at the difference between efficacy and effectiveness studies historically in IES in various places, the way that we talk about the difference between those two is not that treatment effects would inherently vary, but that the difference would be implementation. An efficacy study is with high implementation where the researcher has great control, so we're getting the true effect. And the effectiveness study is when we reduce the implementation controls. And so we see both how well things are being implemented. But the only difference assumed between those two is implementation is changing, where we don't talk about effectiveness as being any other way, except that it's just got less implementation. And then finally, we assume that treatment effects are constant until proven otherwise. So if you think about how we test for, how would we know if treatment effects vary? Well, we do that by doing, post hoc tests of treatment effect variation, moderator tests, variation tests, but those are second order questions. We plan the studies for the average effect, and then we afterwards look to see if it varied. And then when we find that there's no evidence that it varied because it's underpowered, we say, oh, look, it means that there's no variation in treatment effect. So it ends up being kind of an afterthought. So my point is, it's baked in throughout. The way we frame things really works well if the effects are constant. It's even baked into our assumptions in basic ANOVA frameworks that we use. So if you go back, this is sort of the ANOVA framework that we get going back to Fisher. We assume the control and treatment group have the same variance. That makes a lot of sense if what you think is the only thing that happened is a shift, an additive shift between the two. It's an implicit assumption that the treatment effects don't vary. If the treatment effects vary, you can end up with the same variance, but you can also end up with the treatment effect variance being smaller or larger under that assumption. And again, we easily talk about the effect. So when you look at various estimators of like standardized mean differences, et cetera, will fall into this framework that sort of implicitly is just saying, oh, the effects are constant. You can go into a long history of Fisher and why, sort of perspective on this, but constant effects are there. It's also in how we design studies. So when we design studies, we worry about variation, right? It's not something that we're like, it's going to be really interesting in this study to see variation. We're usually worried about it. Why are we worried about it? Well, unexplained variation increases standard errors. It reduces statistical power if what we're focused on is the ATE. And so I have taught at a randomized trial workshop for many years in which the kind of advice that people give if you are designing a study and you want to reduce, want to have more power with a smaller sample size, is to reduce variation. The way that, and this is not just in education, this is in medicine too, you have strong inclusion-exclusion criteria. No comorbidities, no, whatever it is, it reduces variation. Highly selected samples, I would call that like low interclass correlations. They all have very similar means. We randomize at the individual versus group because we know the individual randomization is going to have a bigger sample size, but we're actually but we're doing that because of variation, not because we think individual randomization has to do with the unit of the treatment. Standardized implementation, we're focused on holding constant implementation. So everything is like, if I want to get good statistical power for a fixed cost, I should reduce variation in order to do that. And the end result is that we also end up with samples that are much more homogeneous than the population. So this is from a paper of mine from a few years ago, increasingly many years ago. Jessica Spybrook and I had a grant to look at randomized trials in education. So we identified, I think, 40 IES-funded randomized trials, and we went back and interviewed PIs to find out we interviewed PIs to find out which schools were involved in their studies, and then we did all these analyses to look at the kinds of schools that were in studies versus not in studies. And so these are actually, we took each school's demographics and compared them to the average school compared them to the distribution of the population of those. And the main point here is just if they were the exact same amount of variation in the study as there is in the population on this variable, they would be at the green bar. But when they're below the green bar, it means that their samples are much less variable. So they have far less variation in the number of students than there is in the population. Schools have much more variation in size than they do in studies. And so this is true across just a host of variables. So we've got samples that are much more homogeneous than the population in general. Okay, so I want to set this up as a tension. Are there any questions? Nobody's asked me anything. I was guaranteed that there were going to be questions. Anybody? Okay, so the thing is, yeah, go ahead, Eric. Thank you for.
If this is it on? So, this setup could be about the consumers of our research, the policymakers, and how we need to act or communicate with them in a way that's going to help them. It could also be about sort of physician heal thyself. We are misunderstanding something we do. Are you thinking about both of those?
Yes, I'm thinking about both of those. Yeah. It's much more like we are misunderstanding, I think, and because you're going to see, we have a problem, which is then hurting our ability to findings to people.
Yeah. There's this classic example that seems in some ways parallel, a simpler example of we use the so-called sort of fixed effects estimator, regression fixed effects estimator, and we're implicitly making an assumption about constant effects,
Right.
in order to motivate the weighting that's implicit in that estimator. But like most people don't think about that at all. So
Right.
That's sort of positioning how I say. But some people do think about that, and they think, well, okay, I'm making a trade-off.
Right.
Right. I know that the effects aren't constant, but I'm making a trade-off. This is still a useful average, even if it's not like sort of theoretically pure. So that sort of feels somewhere in the middle.
Kind of in the middle, because part of my point is that we have designed the system, so that's great for us. Like, we can make these simplifying assumptions. We can do this so it allows us to answer a question. But we take the numbers from those and then put them in a clearinghouse. We tell people that those numbers are meaningful to them, even though we've made a ton of simplifying assumptions ourselves in the process. And we're going to get to, and that since that average doesn't actually answer the question they want, the way we've done this makes it hard for us to actually answer the question that they want. And I'll get to that part. But thanks for that. So the problem is that schools aren't the same, right? So I just said we've really hyper-focused on like, how do I narrow in? And I don't think there's a problem with, to be clear, this is how science operates, right? Like, if we want to know something, and we want to know if this one little thing matters, talk to psychologists who are doing little lab studies or people doing brain science or whatever, this is exactly what you would do. You would hyper-focus on this one thing and kind of rule out other things. It's the link between that as being a scientific fact to that being evidence for schools for what they should do is where it kind of falls apart, I'm arguing. So schools aren't the same. What works for whom under what conditions? This is the tagline at IES the entire time I've been in the system. That's what we're answering. So if we just unpack it for a second, we've got works, okay? So works, we gotta mean it's like some important outcome for some meaningful amount for some group of people, and the for whom in this isn't optional. It's actually in the sentence, for whom. So we've often, I think, interpreted this as what works, question mark, that's one question, for whom is another question, and under what conditions is another question. And I would say if that's the approach we've taken, we've mostly answered number one, and very rarely answered the next, second, and third questions, but yet we keep saying the question. Like, enough that people think that's the standard that we're being held to, right? So we didn't say, we built this to tell you what works. We told you what works for whom and under what conditions. We're going to tell schools what they should do, which is the whole sentence, not just part of this sentence. So the problem is that there are a lot of different schools seeking a lot of different evidence. Tom and I were talking about this, like, thousands of schools in the country, and they all are different in different ways. And now we've told them, we can tell them what they should each individually do based upon scientific evidence. This is just me illustrating for you. Like, let's think about the variation in schools. This is elementary schools in the US. There's just a lot of variation in characteristics of those schools. This is like if you were to stratify them into various groups, there's a lot of variation. Point being, like, all the schools are not the same. There's a lot of different contextual ways. You've got large schools, small schools, rural schools. They cluster in various ways. So why it matters is that why would we expect that interventions would work exactly the same in every context? To me, it's actually much harder to come up with an answer to that. It's like, for me, I sort of have started thinking of it as like, I assume the effects are going to vary until proven otherwise, because it's very hard for me to imagine if baseline conditions are different in different schools, if contexts are different and supports are different, why would I expect that interventions would work exactly the same everywhere? Yeah.
So, Beth, because you've seen heterogeneity in, treatment effects lots of places, you've come to expect it. But I wonder to what extent the typical school leader out there is the reason why they're not paying attention to research. Is it really because they have strong beliefs in heterogeneity and they say, okay, you're just telling me the average treatment effect, but I actually don't know, so even if I think there's a lot of heterogeneity, I might discount that a little bit, but I don't know that my effect is like wildly different from this. So it seems like focusing on this requires some understanding of what are the implicit beliefs
Yes.
in the population, and are we answering a problem that we've noticed, or are we answering a problem that users have noticed?
I'm glad you asked that. I wish I had left some slides in that I took out. So I've had these slides in for another talk that I'm going to put in here. This is actually, I don't think it's like substantiated by some work. So there have been a couple of surveys, maybe three at this point, where people have done surveys or survey experiments with researchers and then with practitioners and policymakers. This is not just, some in education and some in development economics. Eva Vavalt is one person who's done these. And these studies they show people evidence of in different ways. And then they ask sort of which piece matters the most to them, or which one they trust the most, et cetera. And what that work seems to, in my read, consistently show is that researchers really look at internal validity. Like, if what matters to you, internal validity. Decision makers really look at external validity. They want to know, was a study in a context like mine? Was it in a place like mine? Was this study, they're much more interested in external validity than researchers are.
But I wonder there are different theories that could drive that. One could be just that there's just something inherent about human learning. I'm much more likely to learn. I'll pay attention to evidence from somebody like me or somebody I know, better. Some school district that I'm familiar with. It's not because I have an implicit belief in heterogeneity.
Yeah.
It's just that, like, I as a primate, like, pay attention to people.
So it could be that it doesn't actually matter the distinction in everything that I'm going to say, because either I believe effects vary, or I only trust people like me, but both of those are going to lead to the same result, which is that our studies have to be more heterogeneous than they are. Because if people want to trust things because somebody like them is in the study, then I need to have somebody like a lot of different kinds of schools in my study if I want them to pay attention, whether the effects actually vary or not. It could very well be that the effects don't vary, but the heterogeneous sample buys me something else. It buys me the ability that people feel seen and therefore are going to trust the evidence more. This is an example from a paper I have with Chris Bryan and David Yeager from a few years ago. About, I think we call it, we were calling for a heterogeneity revolution in science. And this is one of those fun graphs that you make and then it turns into a really nice graph. But I had made a stick figure and they made it really much nicer when they printed it. So the premise of this is just, it's fairly obvious. Imagine you could know everybody's treatment effects, imagine that they vary, and you imagine you got different samples in each study, right? So if I did my first study, I might do it in a place that I think it's going to get the biggest effect, right? Like, I have some idea how can I get the biggest effect? So I get this really big effect. These other ones are I did them in different parts of the distribution. And the effect size is different. And the last one is I actually did a fully representative sample of the population. But the point being, nothing has changed about the underlying relationship here. And yet my treatment effect has changed from 0.3, which sounds huge, to 0.07, which sounds small when I get over here. And it's the thing that I have manipulated is the variation in who's in the study. So I've looked at the places where it would work a lot. I've also looked over here places where it wouldn't work. But if we're not actually looking across this, then we can get studies with wildly different results. We can also get large-scale studies that have smaller effects and small studies that have big effects. Who's in your sample matters. And that's kind of the take-home, is who's in your sample matters. And we can't just keep being surprised by this, but that we have to acknowledge that this is actually really important as we start thinking about interventions. Any questions about that section? All right. So I'm going to move into something I'm going to call an engineering mindset. which is to say, okay, if that's the facts that we have at hand, we are focused on these homogeneous small samples, and then schools are actually rather heterogeneous, and who's in the sample matters, then what does that mean we should do? Well, first of all, it means that the average simply isn't enough, right? That if treatment effects vary, where I do the study of that matters, then what does the average effect from my sample even mean when I send it to a clearinghouse? Schools need evidence that is designed for their context, not the study's context, right? So sometimes the way we study things allows us to get at a scientific answer by making things very solid and holding them constant, but that is not actually answering what this intervention would look like in their schools. They're different, again, different kinds of questions. Like, where do we locate ourselves? Do we start with the scientist and move out, or do we start with the school and move inward in our design? So I want to just sort of step back here and think a little bit about philosophy of science, and to think a little bit about what we're doing in science, right? So in science is about understanding. That's what causality is, right? We want to understand if a phenomenon is true. That's why we isolate. But evidence systems are not, as we can see there's being talked about now, it's not just like we want to know what's true. We want to provide decision makers with information that helps them decide how to intervene in whatever school that they're in. And I'm going to argue that those questions are more akin to engineering questions than science questions. We're not talking about in the ideal. We're not about holding things constant. We're talking about the real world. And in the real world, there's a lot of things happening at once. So I've seen this over the years in IES talking about efficacy versus effectiveness trials. And the language there would be, well, the problem with an effectiveness trial is that a lot of things are happening in the intervention, and I can't know which part of it is that mechanism or not. If I have an intervention that has 10 components and it works, I don't know why it works, right? I just know it works. So if I'm a scientist, that's really unsatisfying. I have an intervention, it's got some reading, some motivation, some whatever else built into it, but I can't tell you the cause, which part of it is, so I can't contribute in the same way to scientific literature, but I can tell you if it works in the real world or not, but they're just not, they're in tension with each other. Like the ability to be applied versus basic is just, I think, really in tension. So just reminding you that these are actually very different ways of thinking. I've spent a lot of time thinking about these two different systems. This is just, again, somebody's presentation somewhere about the difference between them. But the idea is that, in scientific, we're moving up this, we're learning. In engineering, we're applying learning. They're different ways of thinking. If you think about somebody who wants to know, is this a mechanism versus how do I build an intervention to go out into the world? That the building of an intervention is engineering. It's a way that designers think. So I'm going to argue that we should start instead, as I've said, with the assumption that treatment effects vary until proven otherwise. And these are reasons why that might be the case. And this falls in with this sort of engineering assumption, right? That baseline conditions vary. Right? So if baseline conditions vary, of course, treatment condition, we should expect effects to vary. Implementation varies and people vary. So these are all the ways that things vary. And in the engineering perspective, you start with that variance. You start with the schools and the population and the variance and the problem, and you design for that system, for it to work in that system from the very beginning instead of designing to learn something very specific and then hoping it applies. And settings also. So here's an example. Nicole Patenteri and I have a commentary we've been working on, and this is from that example. Nicole Patenteri's at Florida State and is a reading researcher. So for example, what if the end goal, this thinking about dyslexia research, what's the end goal for kids with dyslexia? Who are the students with dyslexia? What settings are they in? We need interventions then that serve students from these variety of backgrounds, that they may not be accurately diagnosed, that work in the full range of conditions, that's kinds of schools that these students show up in. And And importantly, I'm not saying every intervention has to work everywhere, but that collectively as a field, you have to be able to think about, take this into account. This might seem obvious because if you're not dyslexia researchers, you don't know that most dyslexia research happens in schools for dyslexic children. There are because you can get a lot of kids with dyslexia in those places. There are private schools that serve kids with dyslexia. And so a lot of Nicole's work is on kids who are not rich enough to be in those schools. So talking about underserved populations, poorer kids in schools that don't have access to these. There's a lot of evidence in these dyslexia kind of academies, but not a lot of evidence elsewhere. And so this is exactly an example of this problem. Where it's convenient to do research is where there's a lot of dyslexic kids in one place, but that is actually an entirely different context than most kids with dyslexia experience. So my point here is that as a field, we have to worry about this full range. What does it mean for developing interventions, right? Well, I love this picture because this is actually just a picture of overfitting meant for data, but I think of it as overfitting for interventions, right? So this is a picture of overfitting a bed. It's one person. So we need to actually be developing interventions that actually work in the broad use case. And this is, again, the engineering perspective. If I am a scientist, what I do is I start in a local school and I develop an intervention really closely and carefully with that environment. And then I'm going to move out to the next, okay, now I'll move to another school and I'm going to slowly move it from narrow to broad. My point here is instead, this is never going to make it. Nothing ever makes it to broad. And the number of conversations I've had over the years with researchers developing interventions that are like, oh, we'll get to variation later. When we get to the effectiveness trial. Well, there have been 20 effectiveness trials and 500 efficacy trials. So nobody gets to the effectiveness trial. So if we're waiting until then to deal with variation, we're just never going to get to it. But also, it means that you've maybe developed interventions that are hyper-local. They work really well in one place. And then often when people move to the efficacy trial, they find implementation failures. And I think that's exactly a result of this kind of framing, that if you've built something hyperlocal and you get to the efficacy trial and then you realize it doesn't actually work in the slightly broader range of schools that you get, to me, that's a waste. We should have known that early on. So the idea is we should be developing interventions from the very beginning that are really thinking about this variation and contending with it.
But Beth, I think one of the constraints that produces this is related to your dyslexia example. So people do dyslexia research where they can find lots of dyslexic children. Mm-hmm. I think, whenever running an intervention study, you showed earlier that a lot of studies skew urban.
Yeah.
And I think that's just for the simple reason that it takes as much time to negotiate a data use agreement with a 100,000 student school district as with a 1,000 student school district. So everybody does all the
that's exactly right.
Does work. So part of this is not just lack of imagination. Part of it is just the cost of doing research.
You're exactly right. You're exactly right. I'm going to get even more of those costs. I think the problem is maybe if we can know that's true, but also it has actually produced a system in which people don't think the evidence has anything to do with them, right? So it's both, yes, we did that because we didn't have funds to do anything else, and it was cheaper and faster to do the 40 school district, right, and get them all in one place. We can get an answer to a question, but in the long run, most schools don't think the evidence applies to them.
It's like, so might a solution be a foundation specializes in, we'll pay you, X% more if you include rural schools,
yes,
or if you include suburban schools, or.
So one of the things I worked on with IES for a long time, so before IES, rest in peace, perhaps, their efficacy trials over a few years had started requiring that you'd say a population that you were aiming for and that you think about how you were going to recruit for that. And they also were starting to add in more time for recruitment at the beginning. So they had for many years assumed that you would come with your letters of support and say, ready to go as soon as I'm funded, and then There was work that showed that like actually by the time you get funded, most of those schools have fallen out, but now you've written a grant proposal in which there was no funding or time built in for recruitment. And so of course what you're gonna do is just get the nearest schools. And so one of the answers was the funder has to say it's important and to allow you to build in time to do a better job recruiting. To get, and to actually say that this matters. So a lot of it to me is the funder has to believe this is true. Otherwise, the most expedient, cheapest thing to do is to get the nearby schools. Okay, so that has all led up to what I'm going to call 4 hard problems that I'm not sure the answer to this juxtaposition, but I'll show it to you. These are methodological problems. First of all, everything I'm going to talk about is going to basically tell you that the sample matters, right? Who's in your study matters a lot. But if you read studies, people don't say much about who's in their studies for the most part. So whether that's in psychology or education, there's just not much said about who's in the studies. I mean, the fact that we had to go back and ask people to tell us the schools that were in their studies so we could try to understand this tells you how much information they were reporting. We also, in that study, asked PIs to tell us what population they thought that they were representing or anything related to what their generalizability was, and people just could not articulate for us more than what schools they had. So it all comes down to who's in your sample, and I'm going to sort of talk about those samples now. The first thing we know is that if you really want to have a heterogeneous effect, sample, whether that's because effects vary or because you just want people to feel like they are in your study, you have to plan for that. It's not just going to happen by you walking out to the nearest school district. You can get 40 schools in the nearest big school district and be done, or I'm going to tell you you have to, or you could spend a lot more time getting 40 schools across many school districts in order to be more representative. So years ago, I developed this web tool called the Generalizer that helped people do this, that you could say, these are the schools, it helps you think about a population and pick the schools as a way of trying to help people do this better. I could tell you a whole other story about tools like this as interventions that in themselves, that making things easy for people actually improves their ability to do things, and they're more likely to do them if you make it easy. So this tool would say, help you go through a population and develop a frame, and main goal was to take recruitment seriously. But you have to represent the full range of schools. So when I showed you before, there were 6 strata of schools, 6 types of elementary schools. You have to get some in each of those. Maybe the nearby school district gets you 1 or 2 of those strata, but there's going to be some of those that are much harder for you to get because the schools are really different than the schools nearby you. Now, sometimes you can get them all in the same state. You can get quite a bit of variation within a single state, but nonetheless, some of these are going to be easier to recruit than others. And so you have to just contend with that if you really want to represent, you're going to have to put in the work. So Rob Olson and I wrote a guide for NCEE 2022 on generalizability, and we have a whole section about how you need to you need to plan for recruitment, budget for recruitment, think about recruitment strategies in the same way that survey samplers do about non-response. So survey samplers have a whole field of people who know how to think about non-response and reducing non-response bias, and we should be kind of approaching it in a similar way. So to do that, you have to think about things like how might effects vary? Why might they vary? What are the characteristics, I would say, both of why you think they vary and why schools might think it matters so that you can represent them. But it does require more resources. So if you think about what I'm saying more heterogeneous samples, which means I'm going to have larger interclass correlations, which means I'm going to potentially have to have larger samples. Because all of those, improve precision by reducing variation, things I'm throwing out. Things take more, they take longer to recruit, they cost more. You can be in situations where there are places that say, yeah, I'd like to be in your study, and you are like, well, actually, I don't need you in my study because I need another kind of school. So you're really having to make some hard trade-offs. At the end of the day, I think, who knows? At this point, I probably should take the last bullet out because there is no funder funding large studies at this point. But some of it, I think over time, there was a period in which people really did not care about this heterogeneity. I think we're increasingly seeing people are aware that this variation matters. Yeah.
With the kind of approach of trying to like build out a more sort of robust representation across whatever like strata you decide on, it seems like the intent still is to produce like some average effect and then search for heterogeneity within that. But might you imagine like another solution would be, instead of trying to sample across all these strata, like we should be actually limiting ourselves to just study effects within stratas, you know?
You could, and that would be a strategy. And so one of the things that I've always emphasized, I did not emphasize it today, is that just because you want to generalize or think about that doesn't mean it has to be the full population. It just has to be very clear what that population is. So at least clearly articulate the study is focused on urban schools. It's large urban schools with the following characteristics. But that would mean I would need to be a little humble about how far my results extend. This study is about large urban schools. We know it works here. Anything outside of this, I'm going to have to be a little bit less clear about. I'm going to have to be honest about this works everywhere. I've studied if it works here. And collectively, I think funders then have to worry, because if everybody is, and that's like sort of first measure it, if everybody's studying the same kind of school, then collectively the portfolio is not representing schools in the country, and they're not going to be happy that nobody is studying them. Yeah.
Sorry. Sort of related to Marissa's question, I guess.
Sorry, Liz, you should introduce yourself. So, Marissa, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Marissa Combs. I'm a PhD student in the sociology department and a former PIER alum, I guess.
Oh, very nice.
Yes, we met at the lunch, but I'm Elizabeth Welch-Crystal. I'm a PhD student and a PIER fellow. I am thinking about like those situations where you are sort of starting with a larger inference population, right, that you might imagine contains many subgroups that you could potentially be in heterogeneous effects within each of those groups. And I think, I guess my question is like from kind of a practical perspective and thinking about, in particular, like how can you maximize the extent to which practitioners like feel like your results show that this intervention might be effective in their specific scenario. Like I think you could think about, right, first in a district and making sure that you're stratifying by like size of school or like a state, being like, are we getting rural and urban, et cetera. But I guess in some ways I think my brain is breaking a little bit, because I'm thinking like it's sort of like a heterogeneous treatment effects all the way down. Like you could just keep going and going, right? And say like even within rural schools, right, you could think about systematic differentiation and how that might affect treatment. And so I'm thinking like, should we be thinking strategically about what specific subgroups are helpful for thinking about heterogeneity, and how do we deal with the fact that we might not even be able to sort of identify within a given subgroup what actually is within that subgroup, right? Another particularly salient, heterogeneity, right? That we can't identify.
Yep.
And that might actually really appeal to practitioners. I don't know if that makes sense.
So I think I have two answers. You'll see, I'm going to say in a little bit, we don't know much about moderators because we have never designed for them, so we actually don't know much about them, which puts us in a circular problem. The statistical answer to this, which would be, I don't have much information about how effects vary, how can I stratify, would be to do a random sample. To say, I don't know, and so the answer would be to just randomly sample schools in that case. You don't have to know. Now, of course, we're going to end up with non-response, and so you've got to then contend with this a little bit, but the closer you get to the randomness of this allows you to get away from your assumption, which we don't have the answer to. And that's hard because, of course, it's very hard to get schools involved in studies, which maybe mean that the answer to a lot of our problems is we have to think about how to get schools to want to be in studies, whether that's mechanisms at the state level, or et cetera, that there's two sides to this, right? Like whose responsibility is it to figure out how to get these schools in? Yeah.
Another question that's coming up for me is the responsibility component of it all. You mentioned earlier that researchers have to be humble about the generalizability of their findings. Is there any onus on journals and publishers for keeping researchers honest about how far things can be generalized, especially in an abstract, if we're thinking that's what practitioners are really looking at for those quick decisions?
Yeah. I think so. I mean, one of the things I've learned in doing and thinking about this for many years is that scientists really want their work to generalize. And there is really a strong scientific norm around saying things are specific. So even though schools think they're specific, if I said to psychologists, imagine, you should really just be very clear that your results are about college sophomores at Harvard. They would be appalled, right? Like that would be like, no, we are studying the human brain, and therefore I need to say it's about the human brain. If I were to put the constraint on it that it's actually about the sample of students, I'm not doing science anymore, right? Science is about the generalizable. So there is this tension, I'm saying, between scientific norm of like, I want to find generalizable knowledge, and the engineering norm of like, I want to create things that work in specific contexts. They're at odds with each other. And so I think it's part of what makes it very hard. I don't have a great answer. I mean, I would love to say, in the guide that Rob and I have, like we have this thing at the end that's about reporting and how you should be very clear about you recruited this kind of school, you did this kind of thing, but you have to know that that is at odds with what is desirable as evidence and knowledge in science. Okay, so nobody said what I think would be the natural next question, which is, why are we even focusing on the average if you just told me treatment effects vary? Why don't we just stop thinking about recruiting these heterogeneous samples and just move to moderators or something, right? Like, let's just start trying to understand this. Well, I have work from years ago that shows that, not surprisingly, to test moderators, if you want to move to power for moderator tests, they require also really heterogeneous samples. I mean, it makes sense. If you want to know if a treatment effect interacts with something else, the other factor also has to have big variation in it in order to do it well. So this is just like, appealing to your very basic knowledge of experimental design, that if I had a covariate that was normally distributed, the optimal way to do this study would be to put half of my sample at one endpoint and half of my sample at the other endpoint. Right? I would want to have extremes in my sample. I wouldn't want to say, I want to know if this moderator interacts with the treatment effect by having everybody in the middle. I need to have big variation in the moderator in order to have any chance of finding this without having an astronomical sample. This is from that paper. There's something called D-optimal designs. It's a much more general thing in response surface models, but the idea there is you can do this on many different variables and think about. And so this is an example in which I'm taking an exact study and then thinking, what would the D-optimal design do? And you'll see the D-optimal design, these R's are ratios of variation in the sample versus the population. So 3 is like you want your sample to be 3 times its variable in this covariate as the population is. In all of them, you want a sample that has more variation than the population if you're really trying to be optimal in finding that moderator. And you can see what it's doing is pushing things. This is the population. It's pushing things continually to the extremes. So you're always looking for ways to maximize variation if what you're trying to do is cheaply, like with if you want to have a smaller sample to get at moderators, you want to maximize the variation in those. Which is, again, the opposite of what we do for the average.
So, Beth, has anybody looked at, which moderators most commonly is there heterogeneity attached to? So, like, I've been reading lots of things lately where there are huge gender differences. Well, gender, fortunately, most schools have a pretty good gender mix. But like, if I knew it was urbanicity, that would have big implications for, but like, we've got enough studies now where people have produced subgroup impacts. Like, if we could say, okay, here are the subgroup impacts that are most likely, here are the subgroups where you're most likely to see heterogeneity, and therefore design your studies around that, and maybe for different types of interventions?
My sense is no, we don't know much about this. And I'll, as I go through these problems, you'll see why. We've designed studies for the average, and so all of the moderators are greatly underpowered in individual studies. And so I'll get to the meta-analysis problem in a second. You'll see that doesn't solve it, actually. But it is the question that everybody has. What are the moderators? What are the right moderators? And I think because we haven't been measuring them in our samples and measuring characteristics of our samples or doing this in data collection, it's very hard post hoc to do it, because if you didn't think it mattered going in, then now we don't have the data to look at it even across studies. So a third one, which is the more recent paper that I sent you, is that predicting average treatment effects. Okay, the next thing is say, well, I don't want to do hypothesis tests. I'll just want to predict the treatment effect. Why don't I put aside this and just say, okay, effects vary. Let's predict treatment effects for every school and tell them what their effect is. So in this paper, what I'm going to start with is a very simple way of thinking about this. Is like, I'm going to use a regression model to do this. And so I'm saying, okay, this is my average treatment effect variance in this model, and I'm looking at simple random samples here. If I wanted to predict this, my goal would be to build a data set in which I can predict everybody's individual treatment effect. Okay, so I want to predict everybody's difference between their potential outcomes. Obviously, I can't observe each of those. And so I could do this. Maybe a simple way to do this would be to build regression models. I take my control group data and I build a regression model on covariates, and then I take my treatment group data and I build a regression model under those. I get predictions from each of those, and I difference them. And that's how I'm going to get my predicted treatment effect. Well, it turns out, in the paper I work through a bunch of things about prediction error. In this case, it turns out to be a bad story. So this is like broadly what the formula is. I'm not going to kill you with what all of this means, except to say that you can kind of say, well, the prediction error, that mean squared prediction error, so across all of the people in the data set, is a function of just a few things. So it has to do with, well, first of all, this is the variance of the average treatment effect. Okay, so that means this is always bigger than the variance of the average treatment effect. It has to do with what I'm going to call a distribution shift, which is how similar the sample is to the population. So it's right there in the prediction error, that D and that M that show up. So D is a ratio of variances, and M is a Mahalanobis distance. So how similar are they on means? How similar are they on variances? That's comparing the sample that I used to build the model, the training data, to the population of schools I want to predict for. The next to do with extrapolation error. First one is sort of this. The second one is this extrapolation error, which has to do with what if the relationship I have in my sample data is different because maybe it's on a narrower set of values than what it is in the population. So this is just sort of example, prediction error, extrapolation error. My data stopped here. I thought it was linear, but it was actually nonlinear. So there might be error there. And the third one has to do, that tau squared has to do with how much treatment effects vary in the population, which might be different than how they vary in the sample. So anytime you get into people building estimators or models for this, they're going to make assumptions like no extrapolation error, and that the treatment effect variance is the same in the sample as it is in the population, which might be different if you think about the sample being highly selected. But even then, you still have this other part. So it can make very large prediction error. One thing I want to note is that means that moving to prediction does not get us away from that generalization problem that we had before with that heterogeneity. The same problem is showing up here as was showing up there. If our sample is what I'm going to call highly selected and very homogeneous, then I'm going to get a mean and a variance difference, which means I'm going to get prediction error that is even bigger than it has to be. And in general, the prediction error is bigger than the average treatment effect error. So we designed the studies for the average treatment effect, but now we want to do something more with it. So again, just like moderators, we need more data. It's more data hungry. The result is that if I'm thinking about school-specific, so group-specific values, yes, Luke?
Can you go back?
Yeah, sure can. This one?
Just to clarify, error in the ATE estimate is the sample average treatment effect?
Yes, sample average treatment effect.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Luke, for being specific. Okay. It turns out the average treatment effect is actually often the best prediction that we can give for school-level treatment effects. So this is just from that paper. So like I have a cluster randomized trial with 40 schools in it. That's about a typical cluster randomized trial. If I have small treatment effect variation, so about 0.1, which is actually rather large, I would need one predictor that explained 62% of the variation in treatment effects in order for me to outdo the average treatment effect. It never happens. Yes.
Sorry, I know it's picky. Tau here is the variance or the standard deviation?
Oh, this is the standard deviation. You are right. This is the standard deviation. Thank you.
Okay, good.
I'm pretty sure. I made this slide a while ago. I'm pretty sure that's standard deviation. If there's moderate treatment effect variation, so I've got a lot more treatment effect variation, that one predictor would only need to explain 34% of the variance. But that's a lot of variance from one variable. I don't know how many of you guys have done any moderator analyses. They don't explain this much. I actually think the problem is that we have a lot of variables explaining a little bit each. That's my working hypothesis. A lot of things explain a little bit. It's not like there's just one variable that explains everything. That would mean if it's a lot of variables, I need a lot more variables in the model in order for me to outdo, because I have to estimate each of those. So in order to outdo the average treatment effect. So the average treatment effect ends up being the best treatment effect we can give. And in general, if I were to move to thinking about prediction intervals, these can be very wide intervals. So once I put prediction error on this, yeah, I can give you a prediction, but if you ask me for the error, you're not going to be really happy when you see how wide those intervals are. This is where I cite you, Luke. So that was all based on a very simple regression model approach. And so Luke, I don't know where I got this paper. Is it not posted? I don't know. Working paper. I must have found it. Ed working paper. That's where I found it. Yeah. You're like, I'm stealing things from you now, Luke. So he's got this great working paper where they look across all of these different methods and show with like the smallest RCT they look at is 1,000, a sample size of 1,000. These are means, now I'm going to teach your paper for you, Luke, so to interrupt me if I'm wrong. Average standard errors and bias, and so these are mean square errors across, things with similar mean squared error. That's the average treatment effect. And so I just want you to notice the average treatment effect is not being outdone in terms of mean squared error very much by these other algorithms. Like, so they're looking at, lasso and like all sorts of like learners, T-learner, X-learner, all sorts of better methods than the average. But the average is not doing that bad in comparison to them, even with 1,000. So my point is like, it takes a lot of data for these machine learning algorithms that magically give you prediction to actually be very good. And that's not the data situation that we're in. The which moderators question is the big one here. And my point here is that these require us to have a good sense of good moderators that we've measured that can be used in these models. So if I haven't measured variables, and I think here's even harder, I would need the variables to have the same variables measured in my sample as are available to me in population data so that I can actually predict for people. So this is actually very hard. We don't have data systems, I think, that enable this bunch. Problem being, as I said, we've not invested a lot in conceptualizing variation in treatment effects, so we haven't measured a lot. We have effect thinking, which means we need to be doing this better. We need to be theorizing and collecting better data. Is there a question? Yeah.
Mostly I'm just checking for understanding. So the inference I'm drawing here is, okay, as long as you have a fairly representative sample of that you're with whom you're testing this intervention, the average treatment effect is what you want. You're not going to be able to do much better by looking for subgroup effects within that. But the key is, you might say, well, gosh, how is that different from the current world? Well, the key is in the current world, we're measuring the average treatment effect for often a very narrow population. As long as we have a fairly wide population, it's fine to just estimate the average treatment effect.
Sort of. That's a good summary. You'll see I like that towards the end, that in some ways the difference is we're characterizing it differently. So I'm not saying this is the average treatment effect. I'm saying this is the prediction of your treatment effect. This is the best prediction of your treatment effect is the average treatment effect, but it has to include the full heterogeneity of the same population. Yeah. You could do better, but you would need bigger sizes, right? So you can outperform. If I 20 against a typical size of a cluster randomized trial, if I moved that up some, maybe I could do better. But to do better, I'm going to need a much bigger sample than I have. The other thing to keep in mind that I think is worth just reminding people every time they think about predicting effects is that predicting causal effects is very hard. Yeah.
So you're saying that if you increase the size of your experiment, that you could predict better. I'm curious, like, say more about that. Why? Or, I definitely agree with you that we have no moderators that predict anything. So even if we have more data of the current kind we have, we're just going to get a more precisely estimated estimate. I guess the average treatment effect estimate will be more precise, and that will actually reduce the mean squared error. But that's not really actually telling us about the variation in a meaningful way.
I think I meant conditional on something else that Tom had said, which is first that it's a representative sample.
Yes.
So if you have a representative sample and it gets bigger, now you can, because with a bigger sample, you're going to be able to estimate the moderator effects better.
Only if you have moderators that are actually predictive.
Exactly. Okay. Well, good point. Yes, exactly. Which we don't know if we have.
Oh, so you're saying it's an open question?
Yeah.
Like, we have so much noise that we don't actually know if the moderators that we think we want would work with.
Right. We're in like, I think of it as like a vicious cycle, which is like we've always focused on the average. We're not measured the moderators. We don't know what the right moderators are in order to build the predictive model. Like everything is in the same time. Yeah.
Thank you.
And a follow-up question. When we say in this little conversation, when we say representative sample, do we mean that in some theoretical sense, like we're representative of the feature set that is important to the treatment effect heterogeneity, which is different from like we're representative on the kinds of things we usually observe in the data? Like, you know, people say, oh, well, I have like race ethnicity bound.
Yes, exactly.
A representative sample, but that could be not at all representative.
Right. Yeah. I mean, like the ideal representative is literally a random sample because then it's unmatched on observable and unobservable. But you're right. If I'm actually going out strategically to do it, to like sample for it, it has to be the variables that have something to do with treatment effect variation.
So we may never know that we have a representative sample.
So what if nobody knows? What are the variables that are going to be?
It's a circular problem we're in.
Right, so, random sample of...
It's the best answer. A random sample is the best answer, except that it's very hard to get a random sample with no attrition or no non-response.
Well, get closer to it.
Yeah, exactly, but closer to it. The closer we could get to random samples, the better off we would be a good take home. Just a reminder here, it's very hard to predict treatment effects for individuals. It's harder than predicting outcomes. People often forget this. I hear a lot of like techie types who are like, we want to predict outcomes for people. And you're like, but that's not treatment effects, right? So the difficulty is you can validate outcomes. I have training data. I know what the actual outcome is. I can validate that very directly. I can't validate treatment effects in the same way. I don't have each person's individual treatment effect to test it up against. So there are methods in causal inference for thinking about this, but it is not as straightforward as validating outcomes. So it's a harder problem. You think predicting outcomes is hard, predicting treatment effects is even harder. The last one is that meta-analysis is very unlikely to save us. So I do a lot of work in meta-analysis, working with people who are doing meta-analyses, reviewing meta-analyses, et cetera. Here's the answer. I like to say this before people even do the meta-analysis. I'll tell you what you're going to find. You're going to find a small average and a 95% prediction interval that ranges from we're going to be able to say, it works in some places, it doesn't work in others. Sometimes it's producing harm. But we're also not going to be able to explain that variation very well at all. So I have yet to see a meta-analysis that can really fully explain the variation that they see, given the covariates that they have measured. So they'll do hypothesis tests and say nothing is statistically significant. Well, they're probably all underpowered. But even if they try to build a model that explains the variation, it really doesn't explain much of the variation. Now, you might wonder why that is, right? So I have a paper with Linnea Gandhi and Duncan Watts and a few others that is looking at this in a nudge kind of experimental data set. But I think this is actually a broader thing, which is the covariates are really coarse. So because we don't have shared standards on what we measure, and so we're limited to what people report, and then they report it in different ways. So I have age, for example. Ideally, I'd have age as a continuous variable, the average age in a study, right? But what you end up with is some studies will tell you the average age, some will tell you the range of ages, some will tell you the median of age. Like whatever it is, everybody's telling you in a different way. Some will tell you that there are 25% of the sample is between these ages and another 25 is between these ages. And so what happens in the meta-analysis is after all of that, looking across them to find a shared variable becomes under 25 versus over 25 as a dummy variable. So we've now got really coarse version of variables. And a lot of studies don't report enough information for you to get them, so you'll have a lot of missing data. So it makes it very hard to actually explain things if you think there's probably some true relationship here, but it's such a coarse version of it. We've got measurement. And again, often I suspect what we have is a lot of small, like many covariates, each explaining a lot of things. So again, it makes sense, if you were not thinking about variation in effects when you were doing your studies, you didn't measure things and report them in the studies that can then be used meta-analytically. So therefore we're left with, I can see there's variation, but it's very hard for me to understand why. The answer to that is we should probably be like working in collaboration with each other. We should be doing these in a much more systematic way. These studies, what we're really trying to do is understand variation. Okay, so the now what, I don't have great answers. Thanks. I'm gonna say it's just a real predicament, I think. So just to recap, we've got this push for education to tell schools exactly what to do, and we've kind of trained them to think that we can do this with data, like real numbers about what to do. And that some people saying that if we can't do that, then our field is a failure, right? Like that is, I feel like the dominant rhetoric right now is like, we built IES to tell schools what to do. You can't tell schools what to do, so it's a failure. But what I'm showing you is that the infrastructure required to do that is much bigger and has much more money in it than what we have right now, right? So we need larger and more heterogeneous samples. We need more studies, and we need coordinated studies. That is a much more expensive proposition than what we have now. So in some ways, what we've got happened is because of the amount of money that we had in the system. We were optimizing for the constraints that we had. Alternatives. Well, so what are the alternatives then? So we're left with a few options. One is continue to focus on the average effect, but frame it as the best prediction of a school-specific treatment effect. We reframe it. This is our best prediction for you. It's better than any other prediction we could give you. It's just got error in it. Now, the problem is the error could be very large, but it's better maybe than anything else that we could do. You could maybe reconvert that into a probability statement. John Dickey has this kind of work where you turn these into probability statements instead of talking about the size. Another one would be that you could reduce primacy of focusing so much on the numbers of the ATE and instead also talk qualitatively about implementation, comparison group, all sorts of other information. And so you make the average treatment effect one piece of information and a broader variety of decision-making. It's kind of the let's stop thinking about this as numbers for making decision-making and thinking of it as much more like a variety of pieces of information, and the decision you're going to make is not going to be as hard and fast as number is this, yes, number is not this, no. It's thinking of decision-making in a much different way. But the main thing here is that, I have to say, wanting to make predictions about what works in schools, it doesn't mean we're able to do so. Just because we think we can or that we wish we could doesn't mean that we're actually able to. There's another option that I don't like, but that I think is what I'm watching happen in education, which is, okay, predicting school level effects is really hard because it's a small number of schools in studies. Why don't we just move to student level treatment effects? Let's just build models focused on student level treatment effects. There's a lot more students. We have a lot more data. We can collect that information very easily using educational technologies. So now, surely that's the answer. We have more data about individuals. We can collect all of this, and now we can build predictive systems. This is exactly, I feel like in some ways this is the logical conclusion of what works for whom and under what conditions, that we've set ourselves up for, we can't answer that, but we can answer this over here. And I just want to say that we should be really careful about this. It's appealing because it seems like the answer to the question that we've been setting up, but it requires us to ignore context. Those contextual school level variables, we can't use the same problem. As soon as we add them to the model, we have the same problem we had before. So it really requires us to go back to ignoring context and thinking only about students. It's only on what we can measure and predict. The kinds of interventions you can get student level data on and lots of variables on are narrow interventions, not broad interventions. They're like they're in online systems, data sets. So great, we can answer questions for a very specific kind of very specific kind of interventions. And they also exclude data from outside the platform. So these online systems provide all of this data, we can do all of this, and yet it's not telling us anything about what's happening outside of the system. So there's this appeal, I think is what I'm saying, that we've set ourselves up to answer a question. We can't do it very well the hard way, but there's a cheap and fast way we can do it with these online data systems, and it's very appealing. Oh, I can get causal effects, I can get predictions, but we've really fundamentally changed the question, is what I'm saying in doing so. And so where does this leave us? I'm just going to leave you with some questions to think about. I don't have answers. So I tried to frame these in ways that would be about you and your specific work. So one is, does your research treat heterogeneity as something that's assumed to be there or as a nuisance? And so how might your own work center variation in effects as, how would that change the approach of your work? How might it change your conclusions? If you started out from the beginning of your work with treatment effects might vary. The second is, what is the way forward for our field? I mean, we're all thinking about this right now, but my real worry here is that what we desire might be out of sync with what is possible financially, and so I kind of am worried that we might set ourselves up for over-promising, like to tell people we can tell them what works for whom and under what conditions and what works, all the interventions that might work in your specific school or not might be out of reach. And if it's out of reach, then we have just set ourselves up for failure. We've told people we can answer a certain question, we aren't able to answer the question, and now they're judging us, our success, by this. Maybe our questions, the things we can answer, are much more modest than this. And the last one is the ethical implications of this. This shift from school-based studies to I can get a lot of data in online platforms allows us to keep doing the methods that we know how to do, but it fundamentally changes the kind of interventions we're talking about. And I think we should just keep that in mind a lot, that it's very appealing methodologically to make that shift, but without realizing that I have just also fundamentally changed schools. Again, I have questions, no answers. And so thank you. These are just the three papers I think that I've really sort of referenced in this talk.
Questions?
Yeah.
Paper semi-recently, but not recently enough to remember all the details. That was, I think, by Paul von Hippel and Brandon Schutze about not fooling ourselves about effect heterogeneity. And I think they share a lot of the same cautions about a worthwhile desire to think about effect heterogeneity, people paying attention to local context that shapes, how implementations fare. But then I think also reflecting on some of the sort of research about, effects about moderation that don't really track across studies, replication issues. So I guess like, how do you, I'm not sure if you've read that paper in particular, but to the broader kind of conversation of like, given the constraints in a lot of our work with respect to sample size and other sort of issues of partnership with, school districts or getting a wide range of data, like what do you say to the skeptics that, we shouldn't fool ourselves into looking for effect heterogeneity?
Yeah. To me, as I said earlier to Tom, that I think it doesn't matter in my mind if there is effect heterogeneity or not. What matters is the fact that schools will not trust the evidence unless they think they see themselves in the evidence. So I think there are two different questions. Like one is, is there real variation in treatment effects? I don't know, but also we've designed a system in which we assumed there weren't. And then every question we have about variation in treatment effects is post hoc. And so of course we end up like, it's very hard for me to argue well that there is no variation in treatment effects based upon a bunch of studies that assumed there was no variation in treatment effects and then we're not like carefully looking for it. So I don't feel like it's proven to me that there isn't, and I would rather start with there is until I know otherwise. But the other one is even if effects don't vary that much, maybe they don't, we know right now that people don't trust evidence when they see it as not being relevant to their context. And so for that argument in and of itself, like representing people in studies and saying, I have included a school like yours in this kind of study, I am paying attention to this evidence should have some connection to your environment, matters whether it varies or not. That brought a lot of comments. Okay, wow, all right. Go ahead, Luke, and then...
Sorry if I cut you off, Luke. You should go.
I just wanted to follow up on that comment, actually, which is I actually think we have pretty strong evidence of substantial variation. The paper, Mike Weiss's and others' paper on cross-site impact variation basically really feeds your argument of contextual factors, because what they did in the multi-site experiment is they estimated variation across sites. And I think in about a third of the studies, it was large.
You're right. And actually, those numbers, 0.1 and 0.25, I'm remembering, are coming from his paper. You're right, from that paper. You're exactly right.
And I think it was about a third were in the 0.1 range and a third of the studies were in the 0.25 range. So it makes me think about the contextual factors of it might be amusing, at least, to look at the ed tech stuff. If they ever are so bold as to randomize, you could, if you had school indicators, do these basically meta-analysis studies to estimate contextual variation of their very, very controlled treatment that is probably very not controlled in terms of its delivery.
That's a really good point.
And so I think there is a lot of work. I don't think there's nothing there. I agree with you very much that you're limiting your attention to a very narrow set of interventions, that none of which are about actual fundamental school reform, but more tweaks.
But nonetheless, it seems important even in that context.
I agree. So I do think that all of those tools could be applied to these very large data sets to learn about contextual factors.
That's a great point. Okay, now there were a bunch of other hands, so I think you were next.
My question was about, I think it's all related, just thinking about trying to convince a district or school that the evidence is relevant to them seems very difficult, right? There's a lot of work showing that that's very difficult. And I think, like, following up on, I think what you asked earlier, Elizabeth, like, in the extreme, like, we could just, like, get the school in our sample, you know what I mean? But they don't want to be in our sample, so that's a problem. And so I'm just sort of wondering, like, how many, I think your question was, like, how many variables do we need to, like, say you're the same, like, I have a school that's the same on this many things, so my school is like yours, or do we need to do work to help districts and schools understand what it means that we had a large sample and it was a randomly drawn sample? You know what I mean? Like, how do what type of argument do we need to be making, or any type of, like, research or data literacy efforts do we need to engage in?
So I have been thinking of it as I have some other work that I would call, like, focused on knowledge mobilization, but the point there being that we should actually be studying these things, like figuring out what it is that schools care about. When they say, is it like me? Does this look like it would work in my school? That sounds like a great study somebody should be doing to find out how schools and decision makers actually think about this. I suspect that two of the things that they're really asking are about baseline values, right? So, like, often people will say schools want to talk to other schools that they know. right? Another school like them, that they trust another principal or something. It sounds silly at first, but like if the other school is also in their district and has similar student makeup and also maybe has the similar ability to implement or support something, they're matching that in some way, right? That there's something they're looking for as factors that they think matter in how well they could implement an intervention and how might it matter. So I don't have great answers except that like somebody here should study it. Like I think it's actually a really worthwhile question.
Hi. How do you see your work kind of fitting in with the larger field of implementation science, and also thinking back to like Meredith Hodding's work on confronting complexity in ed policy implementation?
Well, thank you. I don't know that work. So maybe it does fit in that work, in which case I will find out. I'll ask you afterwards for more about it. But I don't know, honestly. I mean, I think I have a sense that implementation matters. I don't know that field as well.
Thank you so much for this talk. I think any effort on kind of field shifting is so necessary and needed right now. My dissertation work is similar to this, kind of like field shifting questions. And one thing that I've been wrestling with is that despite any efforts within the research world to shift our own dynamics and practices, policymakers or decision makers still might be asking the "does it work" question. Mm-hmm. And so what is our responsibility as researchers to try to expand their own thinking? And is that a different line of work, or can we do that alongside of this work as we shift our own practices?
That's a great question. So I'll be honest. Somebody asked me earlier, do I work with schools or not? Right? No, I think of myself as a statistician. My policy audience are scientists and researchers, right? And then the research audience is trying to get to schools. And so in that case, I mean, if I could extrapolate from my own experience, it is both, right? Like you are both simultaneously trying to change the practice of people creating whatever it is and thinking about how do you create tools and ways for them to engage, for them to make the right decisions. I will say that like my example here of like the generalizer tool, which is my sort of like how do I get things to scientists, has taught me a lot in terms of, again, it's an engineering mindset, starting from what they know, what they need, how they access information, and then working backwards to how can you provide. I think one thing we have to think about is how do you provide them answers that are not just answers, but are also opportunities to teach. But it's not my area for sure.
Thank you.
So everybody, please join me in thanking Beth for joining us today.